I didn't need her approval anymore, and I certainly didn't expect it. But still, when I told her the news, I waited just a second longer than I had to, hoping. "It's happening soon," I said. 9 o'clock. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then her voice, sharp and controlled, returned. "You're ringing the opening bell?" She repeated the words slowly, the weight of them clearly settling in. My mother had stood at that podium countless times next to my father. For decades, those ceremonies had marked milestones in the growth of the Preston Group. But now, it was me, her daughter, the one they'd quietly written off as the creative one, not the serious heir to the family's financial empire. "Yes," I said simply. Another pause. Then, with a sudden clarity, she said, "We should be there, your father and I. A united front. This is a moment that deserves it." Her words surprised me not because of the sentiment, but how quickly she shifted from doubt to control. One moment, I was the underachieving daughter. The next, I was a public asset, a narrative to be managed. Classic Eleanor Preston. "This isn't about the Preston family," I said gently, but firmly. Finhaven succeeded because it broke away from the systems that held people like me back. This announcement has to stand on its own. She started to protest, but stopped herself. Maybe she finally recognized the shift. I was no longer the child looking for her approval. I had built something without their name, without their money, and without their rules. "I understand," she said at last. The words felt strange coming from her mouth, heavy and unfamiliar. Then she added, more carefully, "Will you at least allow us to acknowledge the achievement properly? A dinner at the estate, perhaps?" I smiled, not out of joy, but recognition. This was her way of regaining control. Social choreography. "We'll talk about it later," I said. "Right now, I need to focus on the announcement and the market." She hesitated. "Alexandra." Another pause. "I may have misunderstood some parts of your professional journey." Coming from Eleanor Preston, that was as close to an apology as I'd ever get. A rare crack in her polished armor. "Perspectives evolve when new information becomes available," I said calmly. I wasn't going to rub it in. That wasn't the point. When I ended the call, I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was something deeper. Alignment. For the first time, the different parts of my life weren't at war. I wasn't two people anymore. I was simply me. The phone rang again. I half expected another family member to call with commentary, but it was Eliza, my right hand since the earliest days of Finhaven. "The exchange is ready," she said, voice steady but alive with excitement. "Financial networks are buzzing. The team's in position." "How'd it go with your family?" I let out a soft breath. "Better than expected. Dad's asking questions. Real ones. Mom's recalibrating. And you?" 15 minutes until the world would hear the news. I paused. "How am I?" I repeated the question aloud, weighing it carefully. "Ready, not for revenge, not for recognition, but for integration, for bringing everything together." There was a long silence on the line. "Then let's make history," she said. "Your car is waiting." I hung up and glanced at the reflection in the window. The woman staring back at me wasn't the girl they used to underestimate. She wasn't the quiet, invisible presence at those grand family dinners. She was something entirely new, someone who had taken rejection and turned it into opportunity, who had built something meaningful, not in spite of being underestimated, but because of it. The car ride to the New York Stock Exchange was quiet, but the silence wasn't empty, it was charged. Eliza sat beside me, scrolling through updates on her tablet. The mood felt surreal, like the moment before a storm that doesn't bring destruction, but changes the shape of the land. "Financial Twitter is imploding," she said with a wry smile. "Half the analysts are scrambling to explain how they missed this, and the other half are pretending they saw it coming." "And the Preston Group?" I asked, keeping my voice even, though I knew exactly why I'd waited until now to ask. Down 7% in pre-market trading, she replied. But interestingly, they've already issued a statement. They're acknowledging Finhaven's innovation and signaling a willingness to adapt. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That was my father, through and through. Richard Preston didn't cling to the past, he maneuvered through it, always looking for the next pivot. It was how he'd stayed in the game longer than most. As we approached the towering facade of the exchange, the car slowed. From the window, I could see reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers gathering. The attention wasn't on the building, it was on me. Not Alexandra Preston, the quiet family member in the background, but the woman at the helm of a financial platform now valued at over $7 billion. My name was trending, not because I had inherited a fortune, but because I had created something that shifted the world under their feet. Eliza and I moved quickly through security, her calm presence grounding me. I'd always admired how she could balance excitement with composure, never rattled, never rushing. The trading floor's buzzing, she said softly. They know today's different. She led me toward the platform overlooking the floor, where the opening bell would soon be rung. I could feel eyes on me from every corner, some curious, some skeptical, some searching for the story behind the story. 2 minutes to go. I stood near the ceremonial button, cameras adjusting, lights settling. I took a long breath, letting the moment fill me. It wasn't about glory. It wasn't about proving them wrong. Nervous? Eliza asked. Centered, I replied. This moment isn't about me. It's about what we've built, what it can do. Her eyes softened. She understood. She always had. From above, I looked down at the trading floor, the polished wood, the glowing tickers, the familiar hum of preparation. This place represented the old world. Finhaven was the bridge to the next. 10 seconds, someone called, and in those 10 seconds, I felt something rare. Not anxiety, not adrenaline, but peace, a calm certainty. As though everything that had once been disconnected, family, work, identity, had finally come into alignment. 3, 2, 1. I pressed the button. The bell rang out loud and clear, echoing through the vast chamber, signaling the opening of a new day of trading. But today, it meant more. Today, it rang in a shift that had been quietly forming beneath the surface for years. In the minutes that followed, everything moved quickly. Reporters circled in. Interviews began. Financial anchors with polished hair and practiced voices now spoke my name with curiosity, and maybe even a touch of respect. Finhaven didn't emerge in opposition to traditional finance. I told one CNBC reporter who was trying to frame the story as a dramatic family rebellion. It came from recognizing what needed to change. It's not about destruction, it's about evolution. Another journalist leaned in. Did your background in the Preston family shape the way you built this? Absolutely, I said without hesitation. Understanding the existing system is what allowed me to reimagine it. The questions came fast. Implementation timelines, market impacts, technology frameworks. I answered them with the quiet certainty that comes from years of groundwork of coding, testing, failing, refining. I spoke less like a disruptor and more like a builder, because that's what I was. By mid-morning, it was clear the markets weren't just reacting to a product, they were recalibrating to a new reality. Traditional financial stocks began to stabilize as analysts shifted their tone. This wasn't the end of old systems, it was their invitation to evolve. Technology indices surged. Investors weren't just impressed, they were ready to follow. The Preston Group's updated statement arrived just before lunch. I skimmed it, unsurprised by the pivot in tone. My father had framed Finhaven's rise, not as a threat, but as an opportunity, a tool to enhance services, not dismantle them. The financial landscape is evolving rapidly, the statement read. The Preston Group has maintained leadership by adapting purposefully. Finhaven's technology represents an opportunity to deepen our value to clients. It was masterfully written, strategic, nimble, and somehow it acknowledged the shift without surrendering power. My father was a master at that. As the press cycle intensified, Eliza and I returned to the Finhaven office, where the team had gathered in the main workspace. The energy was electric, but not chaotic focused, fulfilled. "Hey, we've got something for you," Eliza said. Xavier stepped forward, holding a frame. Inside, it was an old, faded whiteboard sketch, the original Finhaven design, scrawled 4 years ago during one of our first brainstorming sessions. "We saved it digitally before we erased the board," he said. "We thought, today might be the right moment." I stared at the image. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't even all that legible, but it held everything. "This," I said, my voice catching, "this is where it started. Not with money, not with press, but with a single idea that the financial system could serve more people, not just those already inside the gate." I looked around at the team, people who had believed in the idea when it was still just a scribble, who had stayed through the hard parts, who had built this with me. "Thank you," I said. "Today belongs to all of us." Have you ever built something big or small that others doubted, but you knew in your heart had meaning? What did it teach you about yourself? The office had taken on a different energy since the bell rang. Not louder, not faster, just more alive. Everyone walked with purpose, but not rush. The long hours, the quiet sacrifices they'd all led here. And now, for the first time, the outside world was beginning to see what we had known all along, that Finhaven wasn't just a tool, it was a turning point. As I stood in the glass-paneled hallway outside the main floor, I felt a hand on my arm. Eliza. She was holding her tablet, eyes scanning the screen. "The narrative is shifting," she said. Media outlets started with the usual angle. Daughter breaks from family legacy, but it's evolving. They're starting to see what this actually is. "Which is?" I asked, though I already knew. She looked up at me and smiled softly. "Necessary evolution, not rebellion, not revenge, just the next step forward." That mattered more than I thought it would, because from the beginning, I hadn't wanted this to be a spectacle. I didn't want to burn bridges. I just refused to build mine on someone else's blueprint. Eliza hesitated a moment before speaking again. "Your mother has called the office 17 times in the past hour." I laughed, more out of recognition than surprise. "Has she really?" "Your executive assistant's been very polite," Eliza added. "She's been saying you're unavailable until this afternoon." Classic Eleanor Preston. The story was changing, and she needed to rewrite her script to match it. For her, silence was not an option. Control came through presence, and presence came through positioning. "I'll speak with her tonight," I said. "After the markets close, after the noise settles." Eliza nodded. She turned to walk away, but then paused again. "Also, your brother's here." I looked at her. "Marcus?" She nodded. "He arrived about 20 minutes ago. He's in the visitor conference room. Said he wanted to see Finhaven for himself." I blinked, unsure whether to laugh or brace myself. Marcus wasn't one for surprise visits, especially not on my turf. If he was here, it meant he was processing the announcement not just professionally, but personally. I straightened my jacket and made my way toward the conference room. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open quietly. He stood by the windows, arms crossed, looking out over the city skyline, the same view I had looked at hundreds of times while trying to solve problems that no one believed I was qualified to solve. When he turned, his expression was unreadable, but softer than I expected. "You're hard to get a hold of," he said. "That's intentional," I replied with a slight smile. He nodded, then looked around the room. "So, this is it? This is where it became real," I said. "Not the idea that came years earlier, but this space, this team, this energy. It's what made Finhaven more than just a theory on paper." He walked slowly across the room, studying everything. "You know, when I first saw the announcement, I thought, this has to be a mistake, a PR stunt, maybe something Dad was involved in." I stayed quiet. "But then I started reading," he continued, "watching, listening, and it hit me. This isn't a footnote. This is major." I gave a small nod. "It is." Marcus leaned against the table. "Why didn't you ever say anything? That this was what you were building? Would it have mattered?" I asked. "Back then?" He didn't answer right away. "You're probably right," he admitted. "But I wish I'd known. I wish I'd seen it." I softened. For all his faults, and there were many, Marcus wasn't malicious. He just never questioned the lane he'd been placed in. For him, the family structure worked. He didn't have to fight for space in it. "I didn't hide it," I said quietly, "but I didn't shout about it either. I needed to build without noise, without expectations, without comparisons." He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, I think he saw me not the version he'd been handed by our parents, but the woman standing in front of him now. "People are scared," he said. "I know. This changes everything." I nodded. "And it should." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad's not angry, you know," he said finally. "He's impressed and curious. You know how he gets." "I do," I said with a small laugh. "That's why I respect him, even when I disagree with him. He wants to talk, privately," I figured. Marcus pushed away from the table and turned toward the door. "You've done something big here, bigger than I ever imagined. And I think," he stopped, then shook his head. "No, I know Dad sees it too." As he walked out, I stood still for a long moment, processing, feeling, not just what this moment meant professionally, but personally. I had spent so many years feeling like I lived in the shadows of others, smaller, quieter, less seen. And now, not only was I standing in the light, I had helped create it. Back in my office, the windows caught the shifting afternoon sun. Everything outside looked the same. But inside, everything had changed. Have you ever had someone in your life finally see you clearly? Maybe after years of misunderstanding? What did that moment feel like for you? It was nearly 5:30 when I saw the notification light up on my phone. Richard Preston calling. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then I answered. "Alexandra," came his voice, even and composed as ever. "Hi, Dad. I understand congratulations are in order." A small smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. It was the closest thing to praise I'd probably get, but coming from him, it meant more than a dozen headlines. "Thank you," I said. "I'd like to speak with you off the record. No boardroom, no analysts, just us." I hesitated for a second, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure what he wanted from me in this new version of who I'd become. "Of course," I said. "I'm still at the office. I'm already downstairs." Of course he was. I met him in the quiet, sunlit lobby, where evening shadows stretched across the marble floor. He looked as he always did, perfectly tailored, composed, and thoughtful. But there was a subtle difference in his eyes. Less measuring, more listening. We walked to a small conference room without speaking. Once inside, I closed the door. No assistants, no handlers. Just father and daughter, face to face. He sat, hands folded, taking a long moment before speaking. "I watched the entire opening bell ceremony this morning," he said. "Not on television. From my office. No interruptions." That admission alone said more than the words. "Impressive coordination," he continued. The timing, the communication strategy, the rollout across media, seamless, and the valuation. He exhaled slowly. 7 billion. Based on actual earnings, not speculation. I nodded, waiting. He looked up. You've built something serious, substantial. That was the goal, I said. I underestimated you, he said plainly. That landed heavier than I expected. Not because it stung, it didn't, but because of the weight he gave it. Richard Preston rarely admitted miscalculation. His power had always come from knowing exactly how to read a situation before it unfolded. I needed to be underestimated, I said gently. It gave me space to move. He smiled slightly. I suppose that's the advantage of being dismissed. No one tries to stop you. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that feels full, not awkward. Then he spoke again. Your mother is adjusting, as always. I smiled knowingly. She's probably redesigning the family holiday seating chart as we speak. He chuckled, a rare sound from him, more than likely. Then his expression turned serious. You realize the implications of what you've created go far beyond Finhaven. This isn't just about financial technology. It's about the structure of power itself. I know, I said. You've challenged institutions that have defined global finance for a century. I didn't set out to destroy them, I replied. But I also didn't ask for permission to improve what they wouldn't touch. He nodded slowly, considering that. You'll face resistance, possibly even sabotage. I already have, I said quietly. But I'm not alone. He looked at me carefully. Do you have what you need to sustain this? It wasn't a question about money or logistics. It was about resolve. Endurance. Yes, I answered. I've spent years preparing for this day, building the team, the infrastructure, the trust. We're ready. He stood, adjusting his cuffs like he always did before shifting from personal to professional mode. But this time, he paused. If you ever decide there's a way forward that aligns with what remains useful from the Preston Group, he said carefully, my door is open. I'm not offering control. I'm offering collaboration, strategic integration, on your terms. That stunned me more than I expected. My father never gave away position easily. Thank you, I said sincerely. I'll consider it when the timing's right. He nodded, then moved toward the door. But before leaving, he looked back at me. Pride doesn't come easily for me, Alexandra. You know that. I do, but I want you to hear it from me directly. He met my eyes. You've done something extraordinary, and I respect you for it. The door closed softly behind him. I stayed there for a while, letting those words settle in the room. It wasn't the loud kind of praise some people grew up with. I didn't expect tears or a bear hug. That wasn't his way. But that quiet, measured affirmation meant more than applause ever could. When I returned to my office, twilight had begun to fall. Outside the windows, the city shimmered, steady and unaware of the transformation that had taken place inside these walls. My phone buzzed again, messages from journalists, colleagues, even distant connections, now seeing me through a different lens. But the message that made me pause was from Layla. The board at Whitfield Shipping is requesting a meeting to explore Finhaven solutions for cross-border settlements. Their tone has changed. I smiled at that. A week ago, they wouldn't have taken my call. Today, they wanted to explore opportunities. Funny how fast the world changes when you show them what's possible. I looked down at the framed sketch on my desk, the original blueprint. It reminded me of how this started, not from ambition, but from frustration, from hope, from vision. That vision was no longer mine alone. It was growing, shared, real. The family estate hadn't changed in years. The gravel driveway still curved in perfect symmetry. The windows gleamed like polished silver, and the hedges stood at military attention. Everything about the place whispered control, carefully curated, obsessively maintained. I pulled up just after sunset. The house glowed softly against the indigo sky, a picture of warmth that never quite matched its temperature inside. Eleanor Preston was waiting in the drawing room, dressed not in the formal armor she usually wore, but in a soft blue sweater and tailored slacks. Casual for her. Intentional. There was a tea service set for two on the low table. I couldn't help but smile. Not coffee, not wine tea, a middle ground, safe controlled. "You're late," she said, not unkindly. "Fashionably," the first replied, taking the seat across from her. She poured tea like she had 100 times before, graceful, precise. No spills, no noise. She handed me a delicate porcelain cup and folded her hands in her lap. For a moment, we sat in silence. Then she spoke. "The reporters keep calling the house line. One even asked for a comment from your childhood piano teacher." I raised an eyebrow. "And what did she say?" "That she always knew you had an unconventional rhythm." We both laughed genuinely, for once. It was a small crack in the armor, but it was real. Her smile faded as quickly as it had come. "I was not prepared for this," she admitted. "Not the scale, not the impact, not the way the world has so swiftly shifted toward you." "You weren't supposed to be," I said gently. "That was the point." She sipped her tea. "You've always preferred the shadows. Even as a child, you were quiet, watching." I mistook it for passivity. "I wasn't passive," I said softly. "I was listening." Another pause. She stared into her cup, then said, "When your father and I built the Preston Group, we believed in structure, discipline, respectability. Those values shaped everything." "I know," I said, "and in many ways, they served you well, but not you," she added, looking up. "No," I agreed, "they didn't." Her eyes narrowed not with anger, but with curiosity. "Why didn't you come to us? Why not bring your ideas to the family firm?" I took a breath. "Because I needed to know what they were without being reshaped. If I brought them to you too early, they'd become Preston ideas. Finhaven would have turned into another division of something old instead of something entirely new. And you couldn't trust us to see the difference?" I met her eyes. "No, I couldn't." She absorbed that with more grace than I expected. No denial, no defensiveness, just quiet consideration. "You were right," she said finally. "It wouldn't have survived within our walls. Not as what it is now." I nodded. She stood then and walked to the window, her back to me, arms crossed in that familiar way that always meant she was thinking, not reacting, but planning. "You've become a symbol," she said, "not just of innovation, but of independence. There are people who will try to turn that against you." "I know," I said, "but I'm not alone." She turned around. "That's what worries me." Her voice wasn't sharp or cold, it was something more maternal than I was used to from her. Protective, even. "Your father has his strategies. I have mine, but we both recognize strength when we see it. And Alexandra," her voice wavered slightly, "what you've built, it's stronger than we imagined. Maybe stronger than what we built." That landed heavier than I expected. "You don't have to say that," I said. "I know," she replied, "but I want to." She sat back down, reaching for her tea again. "I've been rewriting my speeches," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "The ones I give at events, at the Women in Finance luncheons, all that." "Why?" I asked. "Because the old script doesn't work anymore. Not when my daughter just realigned half the industry." I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't about replacing the old, Mother. It was about adding to it, widening it. "Legacy is a heavy thing," she said quietly, "and I've carried it like a shield. You've carried it like a seed." That stopped me cold. I hadn't expected her to see it that way. "Do you want to be included?" she asked suddenly. "In what?" "The next chapter. Whatever comes after this." Do you want the family name tied to it? I thought for a moment. I want the truth tied to it, I said, that I built something without legacy. But now, if we work together, it's by choice, not necessity. She nodded, absorbing the distinction. Well then, she said, perhaps it's time I adjusted my definition of legacy. We finished our tea in silence, and for the first time in a long while, it felt easy, not performative, not forced, just two women, mother and daughter, sitting in the quiet aftermath of a storm neither had fully prepared for, but somehow both had survived. The next morning started with a calendar that had exploded overnight. Every half-forgotten contact, every name that had once ghosted or dismissed, now sat politely in my inbox, requesting brief time or just a moment to connect. And the phrasing had changed. No longer Alex or Miss Preston, daughter of. Now it was Alexandra Preston, founder, CEO, visionary. Titles that had once felt like overreach now settled on me like a second skin. Eliza stood at my office door with her usual calm, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She handed me one wordlessly, then walked to the window. The energy's different today, she said. I feel it too. Everyone who once wrote us off is suddenly paying attention. They're paying attention because they have to, I replied. Not because they want to. She glanced back. Does that bother you? I thought for a moment. No, they don't need to like it. They just need to move. She nodded in approval. That's leadership talking. I smiled. I wasn't sure I had fully grown into that word yet, but I had certainly grown into the responsibility. Later that morning, the Finhaven board convened for a hybrid session, some remote, some in person. Faces I'd worked with for years now watched me differently, not with skepticism, but with an alertness that comes when you realize you may have underestimated your own CEO. I opened the meeting with a simple statement. We've spent years building something we believed could change the financial infrastructure. Today, the world is finally ready to talk about what that means. But our work hasn't changed. The spotlight isn't the goal, impact is. Xavier, ever the systems guy, jumped in with a calm overview of post-announcement volatility. We're seeing increased traffic to our knowledge base, institutions requesting onboarding packets, and there's a spike in queries from mid-tier banks, ones too big to pivot easily, but too small to ignore us. Let them in, I said. We're not here to replace anyone, we're here to support those ready to evolve. There was a pause, then nods. In another time, another setting, that might have sounded idealistic, but today it rang as truth, and strategic truth at that. After the board session, I met with our communications director, Layla, who had been fielding nonstop media interest. She looked more energized than overwhelmed, which said a lot about her. We've had requests from 60 Minutes, The Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, even an invitation to speak at Davos. Let's prioritize the ones that allow depth, I said. This isn't about a media tour. It's about guiding the conversation. She smiled, noted, and one more thing. She pulled up a message from Thomas Whitfield. Yes, that Whitfield, the one who once proposed merging Finhaven into his shipping conglomerate, like it was a college group project. I read the message silently. Alexandra, my earlier assumptions were clearly misaligned. We'd be honored to hear your insights on how Finhaven could support the next phase of our global finance operations. I understand if time is limited, but we would greatly appreciate even a few minutes of your perspective. Tone shift, Layla said dryly. I shook my head. Tone makeover. Ignore or reply? I considered it. Reply. Short, professional. Respectful. I paused. No gloating. Layla grinned. No promises. She left to draft the response, and I allowed myself one moment, just one, to sit back, close my eyes, and breathe. It wasn't pride I felt. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, clarity. When the dust settles, you realize that what you wanted all along wasn't applause. It was to be heard, not to shout over others, but to speak your truth in a room that's finally quiet enough to listen. That afternoon, Eliza and I met in the atrium, where we often held our more strategic one-on-ones away from the noise, beneath the glass roof, where light poured in uninterrupted. She handed me a report. Preston Group has issued a new internal memo. They're formally inviting exploratory talks with Finhaven. I looked up at her, and she met my eyes. It's happening, isn't it? Yes, she said simply. They're moving toward you now, not around you. I let that sink in. This wasn't just about a company anymore. This was a shift in how an entire sector thought about access, power, and trust. I walked over to the long marble edge of the planter and leaned on it, thinking out loud. I don't want this to be a victory lap. I want it to be a starting point, a place where we prove that better doesn't mean louder. It just means braver. She smiled. You've always been both. I looked up at the glass ceiling, where the sunlight was beginning to slant into golden hour. Once upon a time, I had sat under ceilings like this as a guest invited, tolerated, but never fully seen. Now, I stood here not as someone who had broken through, but as someone who had built something above it. Has there been a time in your life when the world finally caught up to what you always knew was true about yourself? That evening, I stayed at the office later than usual, not because there was work piling up. Our systems ran lean. Our teams were humming, and the dust from the announcement had begun to settle. It wasn't a frantic night. It was a thoughtful one. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Not silence, more like space. And when you've spent years pushing forward, building, proving, there's something sacred about being able to finally slow down, not to stop, but to look around. Eliza knocked gently on the door. You heading home anytime soon? She asked. Eventually, I said. But I think I need to stay with it a little longer tonight. She didn't push. She understood that kind of space, the internal work no one sees. Before she left, she handed me a leather folder. This came earlier, she said, from the archive team. They thought you'd want to see it. Inside was a document I hadn't seen in years. The original Finhaven mission statement scribbled in my own handwriting on a wrinkled legal pad. Before the decks, before the funding rounds, before the interviews and scrutiny, just words. Financial infrastructure should serve people first. Simplicity, access, fairness, not as slogans, but as systems. I ran my fingers along the page. Back then, it felt like a wish. Now it read like a contract I'd actually managed to fulfill. The folder also included a photograph, one I hadn't seen in decades. Me, no older than 10, standing beside my father at the Preston Group's old downtown headquarters. I was holding his briefcase like it weighed more than I did. I smiled. The girl in that photo didn't yet know what her future would hold, but she already knew she didn't want to simply inherit something. She wanted to build. I placed the photo on my desk, next to the whiteboard sketch from our early days. They belonged together, past and present, not in conflict, but in conversation. Later that night, while scrolling through articles about Finhaven's impact, I stumbled on a blog post from a small business owner in Ohio. It wasn't headline-worthy. No charts, no technical analysis, just a quiet thank you. For the first time, I didn't have to jump through a maze of approvals to send money to a supplier overseas. Finhaven let me do it directly. The cost was lower. The process was clearer. I don't know who built this, but whoever you are, thank you. I stared at the screen, unmoving. This was it. Not the valuation, not the applause, but this. A real person running a real business who had more freedom today than they had yesterday because of something we built. It made all the long nights, all the skepticism, worth it. And it reminded me of something I hadn't thought about in a while. Why I started. not to impress the market, but to make the market work for more people. The next morning, I called an internal strategy session small, intimate, just a few key people who'd been there since the beginning, not to plan a launch or fend off competitors, but to ask a different kind of question. How do we preserve the soul of this as we scale? That quiet sentence got everyone sitting up straighter. We've always talked about fairness and access, I continued. Now we're in the position to define what that actually means at scale. And the hardest part won't be the coding or the regulatory work, it'll be making sure we don't forget who we were when no one was watching. Xavier nodded. We could build an internal check, a governance group not for oversight, but for values, like a heartbeat monitor. I love that, Eliza added. We make decisions quickly, but this would be a reminder to pause when the stakes get high, to protect what matters. Layla, our communications lead, leaned forward. And maybe we start sharing more of the why, not just in interviews, but in how we tell our story to new hires, to clients, to partners. We set the tone. We ended the session not with a list of deliverables, but something better, a renewed understanding of what we were building and why, not for recognition, but for continuity. Later that afternoon, I found myself walking through the common areas of the office, the quiet desks where engineers worked late, the empty kitchen where someone had left a half-finished crossword. I passed by a young intern, barely 22, if I had to guess, hunched over a laptop, muttering to himself while debugging something. I paused. Need a second pair of eyes? I offered gently. He looked up, startled, then laughed nervously. Oh, Miss Preston. I didn't realize. Alexandra, I corrected. Want me to take a look? He turned the screen slightly, and I studied it for a moment. You've got a closing bracket floating here, I said, pointing. Might be what's breaking the API call. He looked relieved. Wow. Yeah, that did it. I gave a small nod, then added, don't rush the fix. Understand it. That's how you grow. He nodded, and I moved on, but I knew that moment would stay with him. The CEO helping him debug code at 7 p.m., not because of optics, but because it mattered. Because that's what legacy actually is. It's not what you hand down, it's what you show someone how to build on their own. By the third day, the phone never stopped ringing. Emails poured in by the hundreds. Media requests, partnership proposals, invitations to panels, summits, galas, even one oddly enthusiastic outreach from a Hollywood producer who wanted to option the story. I laughed when I read that one. Then I deleted it. But beneath the noise, something else was shifting. Something harder to name. Eliza noticed it first. You're starting to flinch when your name shows up in the news, she said gently, leaning on the edge of my desk. That's new. I looked at her, surprised by how accurately she'd read me. Then again, she always did. It's not the coverage, I said. It's the way it changes the way people look at me. She nodded. They see you now, but not always clearly. And she was right. In meetings, I could feel it subtle, but sharp. People watching what I said, how I said it, measuring my tone, reading into pauses. Some saw the visionary, others a threat, and a few just wanted to see how long it would take for me to trip. Success comes with a strange kind of loneliness, not isolation, just distance. A gap between what people see and what you're actually carrying. That afternoon, Layla stopped by with a concerned look. You should see this, she said, holding up a tablet. It's starting. She showed me a headline on a major financial news blog, From Legacy to Leverage. Is Alexandra Preston using her family name to buy industry disruption? Beneath it, a photo of me from the bell ringing ceremony, smiling faintly. They'd caught the light just wrong. It made me look smug. I read the article quietly. It wasn't an attack, more of a sideways glance, a skeptical take on how a Preston daughter had somehow launched one of the most impactful platforms in global finance without family assistance, and then speculated on whether that independence was just an illusion. She built it herself, the article admitted. But one can't help but wonder how the Preston name shaped the doors that opened along the way. Eliza read it too, and didn't say a word. I handed the tablet back to Layla. "Let them talk," I said. Truth has a longer shelf life than speculation. Still, the words stuck with me. It wasn't just the assumption that I hadn't earned it. It was the idea that somehow, no matter what I built, it could be redefined by someone else's narrative. That night, I left the office later than usual and walked home instead of calling a car. Manhattan's rhythm helped me breathe again. I passed bookstores, corner cafes, and city dogs in ridiculous sweaters. Ordinary things. As I walked, I thought about the idea of ownership, not just of companies, but of stories, of identities, of how often, as women, especially those with powerful last names or unorthodox paths, we have to wrest back control of how the world defines us. When I reached my apartment, I didn't go inside right away. I sat on the front steps, watching the city move around me, and I thought about a question I hadn't asked myself in a while. Am I still the one writing the story, or am I just trying to steer it? The next morning, I asked Eliza to schedule a media interview. "Which one?" she asked, surprised. "The one," I said. "Let's go ahead and sit down with the journal." She looked at me for a long beat, then nodded. "You want to tell the real story. I think it's time." That afternoon, I sat in the studio chair under bright lights while a soft-spoken interviewer asked thoughtful, pointed questions. We spoke about Finhaven's infrastructure, our future roadmap, and how we plan to maintain integrity while scaling. But then he asked the one I knew was coming. "Your family name carries significant weight in the financial world. Do you think that helped you get here?" I didn't flinch. "I think my name got me into rooms where I wasn't taken seriously," I said plainly. "It opened some doors, but just wide enough for people to tell me I didn't belong in them." He raised his eyebrows slightly. "I learned early that carrying a legacy doesn't mean inheriting its power," I continued. "I had to build something that could stand apart and still stand up to it." He nodded slowly. Afterward, I sat with Eliza in the green room, sipping water from a paper cup. She gave me a look I knew well, part pride, part concern. "You didn't defend yourself," she said. "I didn't have to," I replied. "I told the truth. And maybe that's what this new phase required. Less control, more clarity, less noise, more signal. It wasn't about fighting every headline or correcting every assumption. It was about being so consistent in what I stood for that. Eventually, the story corrected itself. As we left the studio, a young assistant held the door open for us. "Miss Preston," she said quietly, "I saw the piece about you online. I just wanted to say, it meant a lot. The part about doing it your own way." I smiled. "Thank you. That means a lot." She hesitated, then added, "I'm trying to do that too. In a smaller way." "No such thing as small," I said. "Just different stages." She nodded, and we stepped into the New York air. For a moment, I felt grounded again. Not rattled, not pulled, just clear. Because that's the real work, not just building the thing, but carrying it through all the seasons that follow. Even when the world starts reshaping the frame around you. Have you ever felt misunderstood, like people saw your success, but not your struggle? How did you stay grounded in the truth of your own story? There's a strange pressure that comes after success, not to maintain it, but to multiply it. The moment the world starts paying attention, it also starts pulling. Expand faster. Go public. Merge with this. Speak at that. Open a European office. No, wait, Asia. No, both. Everyone becomes an expert on your next move. Everyone wants a piece. But what no one tells you is that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pause. Not out of fear, out of intention. That morning, I walked into the strategy room with a different kind of energy. Not hurried, not hyped, just firm. Xavier and Layla were already there. Eliza joined a minute later, coffee in hand, expression alert. "I want to talk about pace," I began. Layla raised an eyebrow. "That's not the word I expected this morning." "I know," I said, "but I've been thinking, we're not just building for now. We're building for 10 years from now. 20. And right now, we have more attention than we've ever had. That doesn't mean we should sprint." Xavier nodded slowly. "You want to slow the rollout. I want to refine the rollout," I corrected. "Choose our growth, not chase it." We spent the next hour going through every major opportunity that had come in since the announcement: expansion offers, joint ventures, investment pitches. Each one came with flashy language and promises of speed, but speed wasn't what we needed. We needed alignment. "This one?" I asked, pointing to a flashy fintech conglomerate proposal. "No, they want to use our infrastructure to bypass regulation, not to improve it." "Agreed," Eliza said, already marking it off. "This one?" I motioned to another. "Interesting tech, but their ethics don't align. We pass." We moved through 22 proposals that morning. We said no to 19 of them. Not because they weren't lucrative, but because they weren't right. When we finished, Eliza leaned back in her chair. "You know, the old model would call that self-sabotage." "I know," I replied, "but the old model is exactly what we're not doing." It wasn't about playing small. It was about playing long. Later that day, we hosted a roundtable for our internal teams: engineers, strategists, policy liaisons, the kind of cross-functional meeting we didn't hold often enough. The air buzzed with smart energy. People who were still surprised the world finally cared about what they were building. I stood at the front and looked at the team, the faces that had been here since the beginning, and the ones who had just joined last quarter. "I know this week has been surreal," I began, "but I want to remind you we didn't win anything. We opened something. Now the real work begins." They were quiet, listening. "People will want to co-opt our language, repackage our values, water down our structure. The best way to defend against that isn't with noise, it's with clarity. Know what we're building, and why, and for who." There were nods around the room. Afterward, as the team filed out, a junior product designer approached me, a woman I didn't know well yet. She looked a little nervous. "Hi, sorry," she said quickly. "I just wanted to say something. I joined Finhaven because I thought it was doing something different. But now that we're in the spotlight, I was worried it would start to feel like every other place I've worked." "And now?" I asked gently. She smiled. "Now I think I might have been wrong, in a good way." I thanked her, and after she walked away, I stood there alone for a moment, letting her words sink in. It's easy to start something bold. It's much harder to protect what makes it bold once the world starts watching. That evening, I reviewed a proposal that had landed quietly on my desk, a large institutional bank offering to white-label Finhaven's platform for internal use. Xavier had flagged it as tempting but dangerous. It came with generous financial terms, but also with fine print, lots of it. Clauses about branding, data access, IP licensing, the kind of deal that could turn us from a revolution into a back-end vendor. I closed the folder and stared out the window at the skyline. These were the decisions that defined legacy, not the ones that made headlines, but the ones no one ever saw. The ones made in quiet rooms, under soft lighting, long after the cameras stopped rolling. That night, I called my father not to ask for advice, but to get his read. He picked up on the second ring. Alexandra. Just wanted your thoughts on something, I said. Not permission, just perspective. He chuckled. Go on. I summarized the offer. He listened without interruption, then said, It's the kind of deal I would have taken at your age. And now? He paused. Now I'd say it's a fast path to short-term control and a slow erosion of long-term vision. I smiled. That was my sense, too. We spoke for a few more minutes, and as we ended the call, I realized something. I no longer needed to prove anything to him, and he no longer needed me to. We'd finally found our way to mutual respect, not through compliance, but through clarity. Later that night, I wrote a note to myself in the margins of my planning notebook. Let them grow fast. We'll grow deep, and I meant it. One of the things no one prepares you for is that success doesn't just change how people see you, it changes how they see themselves around you. In the weeks following our public announcement, I started noticing it in small ways. When I walked through the Finhaven office, conversations paused, not out of fear, but respect. Jokes softened. People straightened up just a little more when I was near. But what struck me most was the shift in questions. They weren't asking me about company metrics anymore. They were asking me about how to move in the world. How did you stay steady when people didn't believe you? How did you know you were right? What made you keep going when everything looked like failure? I never pretended to have perfect answers, but I tried to give honest ones. I didn't always stay steady, I'd say. I just kept showing up, and that's the truth. You don't build something like Finhaven by being fearless. You build it by staying in the room, especially when you're the only one who sees what's coming. That Monday morning, I scheduled something we'd never done before, a mentorship breakfast. No speeches, no press, just 6 team members, handpicked not for title, but for promise. Eliza helped me assemble the list. Engineers, designers, analysts, people who had asked good questions, stayed late for the right reasons, and quietly made Finhaven stronger. We gathered around a large oak table in one of our smaller meeting rooms, bagels and fresh fruit laid out in the center. I started simple. I wanted to bring you all together because you're the future of this company, I said, and not just in theory, in practice. Some of you will be running departments before long. Others will shape products we haven't dreamed up yet. They listened quietly, a little wide-eyed. But here's the truth, I continued. You're also the stewards of what we've built. And that means asking yourselves the same question I ask myself every day. Are we still building something worth believing in? That opened the door. Over the next hour, the conversation flowed easily. We talked about the risks of ambition without reflection, about what it means to lead when you're still learning yourself, about how power doesn't always announce itself with volume, but often arrives quietly in the form of responsibility. One young designer, Maya, asked something that stayed with me. Do you ever wish you could go back and build this without your name attached to it? No Preston legacy, no shadow. It was such a sincere question. I paused before answering. There were days when I did, I admitted, when the weight of expectation felt heavier than any spreadsheet I was managing. But over time, I realized the goal wasn't to escape the shadow, it was to outgrow it, not through rebellion, through contribution. She nodded slowly, and I could tell she was processing more than just my answer. She was thinking about her own story and how she might write it differently. That's what mentorship is, in the end, not transferring wisdom like a lecture, but creating space for someone to become more themselves in your presence. After the breakfast ended, I stayed behind to gather the mugs and leftover notes. I liked doing that part myself. Not because it was symbolic, though, maybe it was, but because it reminded me that leadership isn't about hovering above. It's about remembering the ground you started on. Later that day, I found a handwritten note left on my desk by one of the engineers from the breakfast. It read, "Thank you for reminding us that vision without values isn't innovation, it's noise." I kept that note. That afternoon, I had a call scheduled with a group of investors who had once passed on Finhaven in our early days. Now, they were interested in collaborative growth pathways. I took the call, listened, asked thoughtful questions, but I didn't lean in too far, because now I understood something I hadn't before. Just because someone finally sees your value doesn't mean you owe them access to it. After the call, Eliza walked in. "They're circling," she said. "They're late," I replied. She smiled. "You're getting good at this." "I'm trying to get good at something else too," I said. "Letting the next generation rise without me standing over their shoulder." Eliza gave me a curious look. "You thinking of stepping back?" "Not yet," I said, "but I'm starting to think about stepping aside sometimes, making space." She nodded, and for a while, we just stood at the window, watching the city shift with the afternoon sun. Down below, people hurried across intersections, carrying briefcases, coffee, ambition. No one knew who I was from that distance. And for the first time in a long while, I liked that, because the real work was no longer about being seen. It was about seeing others and lifting them, slowly, patiently, into the light. Have you ever mentored someone formally or not, and seen them grow in ways that surprised you? What did you learn from the experience? The invitation came by courier, not email, not a phone call, but a sealed envelope, delivered by hand, addressed in my mother's unmistakable script. It was an invitation to speak at the Preston Foundation's annual summit, a tradition steeped in prestige, old money, and power in pressed suits, the same event where I'd once stood awkwardly at 17, sipping sparkling water, while donors asked if I was the artsy one. Back then, I hadn't even rated a formal introduction. Now, they wanted me on stage, as the keynote. I read the invitation twice. No one had to say the words, but I knew what it meant. The family wasn't just acknowledging me, they were repositioning me. I was no longer the wayward daughter, the quiet rebel with a laptop and unrealistic ideas. I was someone they wanted at the table, someone they needed. That alone was a lot to process. Eliza found me in my office that afternoon, the envelope still on my desk. "You going?" she asked with a knowing look. "I haven't decided," I replied. "Are you hesitating because it's them or because it's you?" I smiled. "Yes." She sat across from me, calm and grounded as always. "This isn't about proving anything anymore," she said gently. "You already did that. Now it's about presence, about showing up differently." She was right. The invitation didn't feel like a test. It felt like a doorway, and I had the choice to walk through it or not. The event was held in the grand ballroom at the Lancaster Hotel crystal chandeliers, monogrammed silver, the faint scent of roses and power. I wore a simple navy suit, no statement necklace, no bright color, just clarity and confidence. As I stepped into the space, people turned not out of shock, but recognition. There she is. That's her. I moved through the room with calm certainty, no longer a footnote in someone else's narrative. I was walking my own story now. I spotted my brother Marcus near the entrance to the ballroom. He raised his glass when he saw me, a warm, subtle nod. "Nice of you to drop in," he said, joining me. I figured I'd try mingling with the old guard. He laughed. "You realize you're the new guard now, right?" I gave him a look. "Don't you dare say that again." We shared a smile easier than before. Our relationship had softened in recent weeks. We still saw the world differently, but there was space now. Space for both of us to belong. "Mother's thrilled you accepted the invitation," he said, as we moved toward the front of the room. I didn't accept it for her, I replied. I accepted it because I built something worth bringing into rooms like this. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. When the program began, I sat quietly at the head table, listening to the other speakers. Industry leaders, foundation heads, family friends, all polished, predictable. Then my name was called. There was a polite round of applause. I stepped onto the stage, the soft click of my heels echoing through the room. I stood behind the podium, looked out at the audience, and exhaled. Here we go. I wasn't always invited to events like this, I began, my voice steady. And when I was, I didn't speak. I watched. I listened. I learned how power moved, how it dressed, how it greeted others, how it shook hands. There was a ripple of laughter, familiar smiles in the audience. But eventually I realized something. I continued. There's another kind of power, quieter, slower, built not in rooms like this, but in smaller ones, cafes, studios, co-working spaces, in places where the ceilings leak and the lights flicker, but the ideas are strong enough to survive anyway. I paused. Let the silence breathe. Finhaven was born in one of those rooms, not out of rebellion, but out of need. Out of the belief that people deserved more access, more trust, more clarity in how their money moved through the world. A few heads nodded. And today, I'm not here to ask for validation. I'm here to offer something else, an invitation. To join us, not because the market says we matter, but because the mission does. The applause was real this time, not loud, but honest. As I stepped down from the podium, I felt a hand slip gently into mine. It was my mother. She didn't say a word, but her expression said everything. Pride, humility, and maybe finally understanding. We walked back to our table together. No performance. No press photos. Just two women carrying the weight of legacy in different ways. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a bridge. After the event, I lingered in the courtyard. The city lights sparkled against the evening sky. Cool air, clear thoughts. Marcus joined me, 2 cups of espresso in hand. For the record, he said, handing me one, that was the best speech of the night. I smiled. You're biased. Of course I am, he said. But I'm also right. We stood quietly for a while, looking out over the city that had raised us, shaped us, and in some ways, divided us. You ever think about what comes next? He asked. All the time, I said. And I think it's time to start building things I may never see finished. He nodded, slow and thoughtful. That's when you know it's legacy. It started as a quiet thought one I didn't voice out loud for weeks. What if I wasn't needed in the same way anymore? Not because I was leaving, not because I was tired, but because the company, the vision was strong enough to stand, even without me at the center of every decision. That's the thing no one tells you about building something real. Eventually, if you've done it right, you start to disappear from the day-to-day. Not because you're less important, but because the thing is finally bigger than you. And that's exactly what I wanted. But letting go, even gently, takes a different kind of courage. Eliza and I met for lunch at a small cafe tucked away from the chaos of Midtown. We rarely left the office during the day, but I needed time off the grid space to think without charts and metrics staring back at me. You've been quiet, she said, sipping her tea. I've been thinking. That's usually dangerous, she teased, smiling. What's on your mind? I looked at her, not entirely sure how to say it. But then, I just did. I think it's time to start delegating the future. She didn't flinch. I don't mean stepping down, I added quickly. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. But I want to start building the next layer of leadership deeply, intentionally. She nodded slowly. You mean letting others start steering? Yes. Not just operationally, but philosophically. I want the vision to outlast me. Eliza smiled, a little bittersweet. You're ready to go from builder to steward. That's exactly it. The following week, I sent out 6 handwritten invitations, each one carefully worded, each one personal. They weren't for a promotion. They were for something deeper, a circle, an internal working group that would become the soul of Finhaven's next chapter, a mix of departments, backgrounds, ages, and perspectives. People who had demonstrated not just intelligence, but integrity. I called it the Continuity Council. We met on a Thursday morning in one of the company's quieter rooms. No glass walls, no observers, just a table, 7 chairs, and a simple agenda. What must remain true? That was the first question I asked them. Not, what's next? Not, how do we grow faster? But, what must remain true for Finhaven to still be Finhaven? The conversation was electric, thoughtful, honest. They talked about transparency in our systems, real accessibility for underserved regions, and not compromising on ethical data use, even when tempted by lucrative shortcuts. They weren't echoing me. They were building on me, and that was the moment I knew we were ready to evolve. A few days later, I stood in our rooftop common space, looking out over the city. Eliza joined me, holding a folder. New partnership proposal from the Health Tech Coalition, she said. They want to explore embedded finance models with our infrastructure. I flipped through the summary. It's solid, I said. Useful, impactful, and I'm not the right person to lead that initiative. She looked up. I want Maya to run point on it, I continued. With support from our policy team, she's ready. Eliza nodded. That's a big step. I know, I said. But the work we're doing now, it's not about protecting my name. It's about preparing the people who'll carry the mission forward. She closed the folder. I've worked with a lot of founders, she said, but you're one of the few I've seen who knows when it's time to get out of the spotlight and into the soil. I smiled. Growth comes from underneath. That weekend, I visited the original co-working space where I'd first mapped out the concept of Finhaven. The building was still there, now shinier, trendier, but the little 3rd-floor conference room, the one with the broken heater and creaky chair, still stood. I asked if I could sit in it for a few minutes. The receptionist blinked, then nodded. Of course. I sat alone in that room for nearly an hour. No laptop, no agenda, just memory and gratitude. Because in that little space, years ago, I wrote down words that I barely believed could ever become real. Financial fairness, inclusive infrastructure, systems that work for everyone, not just the insiders. Now those weren't just ideas, they were lived, not perfectly, not fully, but genuinely. And more importantly, they didn't live inside me anymore. They lived inside the people who had joined the mission, the ones who would carry it forward, adjust it, challenge it, protect it. That's the shift. No one talks about the quiet but powerful movement from founder to foundation. When I left the building, I didn't feel nostalgic. I felt peaceful, like I'd planted something good, and it was growing. Back at the office on Monday, I found a note on my desk, another one in familiar handwriting. It was from my mother. I heard about your Continuity Council. I think it's the smartest thing you've ever done. It's not easy to let go of the reins, but it's even harder to trust others with the road ahead. I'm proud of the woman you've become, not just for what you've built, but for how you're letting it grow. I didn't cry, but I closed my eyes for a long time, because sometimes the deepest victories aren't loud. They're whispered quietly, from one generation to the next. When did you first realize that the greatest thing you could leave behind wasn't a product or a project, but a set of values someone else could carry? It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon when the call came. I was between meetings, sipping lukewarm coffee and reviewing a research draft from our new data team when my assistant knocked gently on the glass. Your mother's online one, she said. She says it's not urgent, but important. That was her way, never dramatic, always measured, but rarely casual. I picked up the receiver. Alexandra, she said, voice calm, clipped. Your grandfather's home is being listed for auction, the one in Rye. I paused. I hadn't thought about that house in years. The porch with the chipping white paint, the creaky steps, the attic I used to hide in with notebooks and a flashlight when family dinners became too loud. Do you want to go see it before it's gone? She asked. I did. That Saturday, we drove up the old roads, just the two of us. No driver, no staff, just mother and daughter, sharing a silence that felt less like distance now and more like peace. The house stood as I remembered it, weathered, proud, and a little tired. The paint had peeled further, and the garden was overgrown, but the bones of it still held. We walked through slowly, her heels clicking across the hardwood. The kitchen still had the cracked tile from where I once dropped a cast iron pan. The staircase still groaned on the fourth step. In the study, I ran my hand over the old oak desk where my grandfather used to sort through bank ledgers and newsprint, muttering to himself about interest rates and what they weren't telling you. He was the first person to tell me that systems are just people and patterns, and that patterns can be changed. I never forgot that. Why didn't we keep this place up? I asked softly. My mother hesitated. It was too much, too many memories, and not all of them good. I understood. Some legacies aren't meant to be inherited, just acknowledged. We walked to the backyard, where a few yellowing apple trees still stood stubbornly in the wind. He used to say those trees were survivors, I said. They were planted during a drought, she replied. Everyone told him they'd never take root. He said they just needed time. She paused, looking out at the trees. He said that about you once, too. I turned to her. You were 8, she added. You'd just built a city out of shoeboxes in the attic. He looked at me and said, She's different. Give her time. She's got her own drought to conquer. I hadn't known that. We stood there for a long time, the wind tugging gently at our coats. And for once, there was no performance, no correction, just presence. Before we left, I walked back inside and climbed up to the attic. The little space was dusty, the window fogged, but the wooden crate I used as a writing table was still there, tucked in the corner. I sat down on the floor and pulled my coat tighter. And for the first time in years, I let myself go all the way back to that version of me who wrote stories in secret, who dreamed of systems that could be different, even before she knew the words for what she was imagining. She was still in there, and she was proud. When I returned to the city, something had shifted, not visibly, but inside. Legacy had always felt like something heavy, like a suit I didn't want to wear. But maybe it wasn't about the suit. Maybe it was about choosing your own fabric and cutting it to fit. The next day, I wrote a letter to our board. Not a resignation, a repositioning. I asked to transition into a new role, founder emeritus and strategic steward, effective within the next fiscal year. I would remain involved in vision, oversight, and values, but day-to-day operations would move to a new executive team, people I trusted, people I'd mentored, people who had already earned their place. There was no drama in the decision, just clarity. The future needed room to grow. We announced the transition at a town hall the following month. I stood before the team with steady breath and clear words. When I started Finhaven, I said, I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was trying to make a difference, and I still am. But I've always believed that leadership isn't about holding the spotlight. It's about sharing it. They listened not with sadness, but with strength. Because this wasn't a goodbye. It was an expansion. Afterward, Maya, now the incoming Chief Vision Officer, came to find me. You really meant it, didn't you? She asked. About letting us carry it. I nodded. I didn't build this to protect it from change. I built it to welcome it. Her eyes glistened just a little. We won't let you down. I know, I said. And if you do good, that means you're learning. She laughed, and then we hugged, not as colleagues, but as women standing on the same foundation. That evening, I sat by the window in my apartment, watching the city hum below. Everything felt still, not stagnant, just settled. I pulled out my old notebook, the one from the early Finhaven days. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were my original scribbles, systems, diagrams, mission phrases, pages filled with half-finished thoughts that, back then, felt like whispers into the dark. But one line, written in block letters, caught my eye. Start something you won't finish. I had, and I couldn't imagine anything more fulfilling. It's funny how the loudest moments in life are often followed by the quietest ones. The headlines faded, the calls slowed, the endless buzz around Finhaven's valuation, and my transition began to settle like dust in a sunlit room. The world had moved on, as it always does, and I found myself finally with time. Not time to plan, time to be. I spent a few mornings just walking. No destination, no phone in my hand, just me and the city, moving together. I wandered into bookstores I used to visit in my 20s, sat in old cafes where I once scribbled ideas on napkins, unsure if they'd ever mean anything. It was like stepping back into the margins of my own life. The quiet places that shaped me more than any conference stage or company boardroom. One afternoon, I stopped by the park bench where I used to sit and watch the world go by after work back when I was still teaching myself how global finance really moved, back when I was building Finhaven quietly, in the hours nobody else wanted. It looked the same, faded wood, a little lopsided, still facing the same tree with the scratchy bark that turns golden in the fall. I sat for a long time. I watched a mother help her toddler tie their shoes. I watched an older man pull breadcrumbs from his pocket and scatter them for the pigeons. And I thought to myself, this is what it was always about. Not the deals, not the milestones, but the people, the ordinary ones, the invisible ones, the ones whose lives are shaped by systems they didn't design, and whose potential is often hidden by lack of access. Finhaven wasn't about breaking systems. It was about opening them so that a mother in this park could transfer money to her sister in another country without paying half in fees, so that a retired couple in Ohio could understand their investments without needing a dictionary and a degree, so that a young coder could bring an idea to market without begging legacy institutions to take a chance on them. And I had done it. Not perfectly, not entirely, but meaningfully. One evening, I had dinner with my parents at the family estate. It had been a while since all three of us were in the same room without an agenda. No announcements, no press, just food and history and the kind of conversation that only comes when no one's trying to prove anything. My father raised his glass midway through the meal. To the quiet chapters, he said. I smiled. What do you mean? He looked at me with that thoughtful stillness he always carried, the ones after the spotlight fades, the ones where you find out who you are without the crowd. He was right. Those chapters matter more than anyone admits. They're not less important, they're just less photographed. Later that week, I stopped by our new Finhaven community office in the Bronx. It wasn't a flashy space, just a clean, sunlit room with computers, community advisors, and a few posters about financial literacy. A local woman, maybe in her 60s, stood at the desk, speaking with one of our advisors about transferring funds to her grandson overseas. She wore a simple coat and held a stack of handwritten notes. She glanced over at me, then back to her paperwork. She didn't recognize me, and that was perfect, because it meant the system was working without me needing to be there. She didn't need to know who built the platform. She just needed to know it worked. And in that moment, I realized my name didn't need to be attached to every transformation, just the first one. That night, I lit a candle at home and pulled out an old, dog-eared copy of a book my grandfather once gave me, The Wisdom of Quiet Things. He had underlined a passage in blue ink that I'd read before, but this time it landed differently. The most enduring legacies are not made of stone or title, but of moments made easier, lives made lighter, paths made clearer because you passed through. That's what I wanted. Not monuments, but momentum. And maybe that's what success really is, not what stays about you, but what moves forward without you. I got an email that same week from someone I hadn't heard from in over a decade, a college classmate who had seen the news about my transition. He wrote, "You always saw things differently. I remember you staying after class, trying to explain financial fairness to a room that just wanted to pass the exam. I didn't get it then, but now I see what you meant. Just wanted you to know that. It mattered." I stared at the screen for a long time, because you never really know who's watching. You never know what words stay with someone long after they leave the room. And you never know how many seeds you've planted until something blooms in the distance, far from where you first placed it. The city kept moving as it always does, and I kept walking, not ahead of it, but beside it. No longer trying to shape everything, just letting some things shape me. And quietly, gently, without fanfare, I began to understand the kind of legacy that doesn't need a name, only impact. Have you ever found peace, not in doing more, but in finally recognizing the quiet impact of what you've already done? I woke up just after sunrise, not to an alarm, but to light. The kind that slips gently through sheer curtains, patient and golden, the kind that doesn't rush you out of bed, but invites you into the day. I lay there for a while, listening, not to pings or alerts, but to the stillness, the city's early morning hush, a dog's collar jingling on the street below. Somewhere, a bakery opening its shutters. There was no urgent calendar today, no pitch decks or press briefings, no interviews or back-to-back calls, just space. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to fill it. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the world wake up. And I thought, as I often did now, about what remains. Not what you achieve, not what you accumulate, but what's left when the meetings are over, when the applause has quieted, and when your name starts fading from the headlines. What remains then? For me, it wasn't Finhaven's valuation. It wasn't the bell I rang at the exchange. It was a handwritten thank you note from a grandmother in Kansas who used our platform to open her first investment account. It was a team of developers I mentored, now mentoring others. It was watching a system I helped shape stay standing, even when I stepped away. That was the real success. Not being the center of the story, but building something that didn't need me to be. Around mid-morning, I visited a small neighborhood cafe on the Lower East Side, a place I'd once used as an unofficial office during the early Finhaven years. They still had the same chipped mugs and the mismatched chairs. The barista recognized me not as a public figure, but as an old customer. "You used to sit in the corner and scribble for hours," he said, smiling. "I always wondered what you were working on." "Something I wasn't sure would work," I said, smiling back, "but I'm glad I kept going." I stayed for a while, answering a few emails, reading a long article about sustainable microfinance. Then I tucked the tablet away and just watched people come and go. I wasn't here to be seen. I was here to see. That afternoon, I met Eliza at a small nonprofit event in Brooklyn. It wasn't a big gala, just a gathering of local organizers working on community banking initiatives. Finhaven had helped them get seed funding. I'd insisted we keep supporting projects like this, quietly and consistently. We arrived just as a young woman took the mic to share her story. She was a single mother, formerly unbanked, who'd been locked out of traditional lending systems for years. Through one of the partner programs, she received access to tools and training. Now she was launching her own catering business. "I didn't need a handout," she said. "I needed a door that wasn't locked." The room went still, and my eyes welled, not out of sadness, but out of recognition. She was the reason. They were the reason. This was why I'd started Finhaven. Not to disrupt headlines, but to unlock possibilities. After the event, she came over to thank us. She didn't know who I was exactly. Not fully. Just that I had something to do with the platform. I didn't correct her. I just shook her hand and told her what was true. "I'm so proud of what you're building, because that's what mattered now. Not what I'd built, but what others could build because of it." That evening, I returned home and sat in my study, a cup of tea cooling beside me. On my desk were 3 small objects I kept nearby, reminders of the journey: the framed whiteboard sketch from Finhaven's earliest architecture draft, a photo of my grandfather in his home study, scribbling on a yellow legal pad, and the letter from my mother, where she told me at long last that she was proud not just of what I'd done, but how I let it grow. Together, they told a quiet story, not a flashy one, but a true one. People ask what legacy feels like. They expect it to be triumphant, elevated, grand. But legacy, I've learned, feels human. It's soft, woven into lives that don't know your name, laced through systems that continue long after you've left the room. It's not a speech. It's a child getting a college loan with fair terms, a business owner accessing capital without red tape, a community learning how to manage its own resources. That's legacy. And if you're lucky, you live long enough to see it, but wise enough to step back and let it move without you. As the sky faded into evening, I wrote one last note in the back of my journal. You don't build forever by holding on. You build forever by letting go at the right time and trusting what you planted will rise. I closed the book. No need to say more. The work had been done, and it would keep growing. As we grow older, we begin to understand something that youth rarely teaches us. Real success isn't about how loudly the world applauds, but how deeply the impact lingers after the stage is empty. Alexandra's journey isn't just about building a financial empire. It's about learning when to lead, when to listen, and ultimately, when to let go. In a culture obsessed with recognition, this story gently reminds us that legacy isn't carved in stone. It's found in the quiet moments, mentoring a younger voice, opening a door someone else had always found locked, choosing purpose over pride. Letting go isn't a loss, it's a gift. It says, I've built enough to trust what comes next. For those of us who've spent decades building families, careers, and communities, this message lands softly but powerfully. What we leave behind doesn't need to carry our name, to carry our heart. So perhaps the most meaningful thing we can do now isn't to hold on tighter, but to loosen our grip, share our wisdom, and watch the next generation rise. Not because they carry us forward, but because we helped show them how.